Hey guys, tonight we begin with trade, very civilized trade, the kind that involves addiction, gunboats, and politely explaining destruction as free commerce. So before you get comfortable, take a moment like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. At the dawn of the 19th century, the Qing Dynasty ruled over what it considered a fully completed civilization. Not developing, not emerging. Completed, finished. Like a perfectly written book with no need for a sequel. China was vast, wealthy, orderly, and deeply convinced it had already figured everything out centuries ago. From the imperial court in Beijing, the world made perfect sense. China sat at the center of civilization, the Middle Kingdom, and everything beyond its borders existed in various stages of cultural confusion. Europe, from this perspective, was a distant land full of noisy merchants, odd clothing choices, and an unhealthy obsession with boats. And honestly, China had receipts. The empire fed hundreds of millions. Its bureaucracy functioned with terrifying consistency. Scholars spent their lives memorizing texts older than most European capitals. Examinations decided careers, not sword fights, which already put China several centuries ahead in terms of workplace professionalism. Most importantly, China produced the things everyone wanted. Tea fueled Europe's mornings. Silk wrapped aristocrats in status. Porcelain sat delicately on tables where people argued loudly about philosophy while drinking Chinese beverages out of Chinese cups. The global economy ran on Chinese products, whether Europe liked it or not. And what did China want in return? Silver. Just silver. No opinions, no gadgets, no unsolicited advice. Just shiny metal, please. This worked beautifully. Silver flowed in. Taxes were paid. Armies were funded. The imperial machine hummed along like a well-maintained clock, one made of tradition, hierarchy, and quiet confidence. Trade was tightly controlled, restricted to specific ports, and conducted entirely on Chinese terms. Foreign merchants followed the rules, or went home disappointed. There was no customer service department. But here's the problem with believing you need nothing. You stop watching people who need something desperately. While China viewed trade as a polite formality, Britain viewed it as a crisis. British silver was vanishing into China at an alarming rate, and empires hate that almost as much as they hate being told no. Somewhere in London, officials stared at balance sheets and began asking the most dangerous question in imperial history. What if we changed the rules? China, secure in its superiority, didn't notice the shift. It assumed foreigners would continue behaving like guests forever. It assumed admiration equaled submission. And that assumption, calm, confident, and completely reasonable, was about to become very expensive. While China was calmly enjoying its position as the world's cultural center, Europe was developing a very specific, very expensive habit. Tea. And not the casual, once-in-a-while kind. This was a daily ritual that shaped mornings, politics, and the emotional stability of entire nations. In Britain especially, tea was no longer a drink. It was infrastructure. British society ran on it. Workers drank it. Aristocrats drank it. Politicians drank it while pretending not to panic about the economy. The problem was that every cup of tea came from China, and China insisted on being paid in silver. No discounts, no trade credits, no loyalty points. From the Chinese perspective, this made perfect sense. Why accept foreign goods you do not need when everyone is lining up to hand you precious metal? From the British perspective, this was a financial nightmare wearing a polite smile. Silver began leaving Britain at a rate that caused real concern. Balance sheets looked increasingly grim. The empire could conquer continents, command oceans, and control global trade routes, yet somehow could not convince China to buy wool coats or industrial trinkets. It was deeply humiliating. British merchants tried everything. They offered textiles. China had better ones. They offered machinery. China was unimpressed. They offered clocks, mirrors, and novelty items that looked impressive for about 10 minutes. Chinese officials nodded politely and asked for silver. This is the moment where two worldviews collided. China believed trade was a controlled exchange that existed for stability. Britain believed trade was a tool for expansion, leverage, and profit. When trade did not benefit Britain, Britain did not consider that a failure. It considered it a challenge. British officials began asking dangerous questions. Why should silver keep flowing one way? Why should China dictate the terms? And most importantly, what could Britain sell that China could not refuse? The answer, unfortunately, was not tea, silk, or porcelain. It was addiction. Somewhere between frustration and imperial entitlement, British traders realized that China did not need more goods. It needed a problem. And if you could introduce that problem quietly enough, profit would follow. Tea had created a dependency in Europe. Now Britain was about to export one back. And unlike tea, this new product would not be poured gently into cups. It would seep into society, dissolve discipline, and rewrite the balance of power entirely. China had no idea this was coming. Britain absolutely did. Once Britain accepted that China did not want its products, officials turned to the next stage of imperial problem solving: creativity with a loose relationship to morality. If China refused to buy British goods, Britain would simply introduce something China did not yet realize it needed, and by needed, we mean would soon be unable to function without. Enter opium. Opium was not new to China. It had existed for centuries in limited medicinal and recreational use. What was new was scale. Britain, through its control of India, suddenly had access to massive opium production. Fields were planted, harvests were refined, supply chains were organized with impressive efficiency, and absolutely no concern for long-term consequences. This was not an accident. It was not a misunderstanding. It was policy. The logic was chillingly simple. Opium was lightweight, valuable, and addictive. Once people started using it regularly, demand would sustain itself. Best of all, it could be sold for silver, the exact resource Britain was losing to tea imports. The trade imbalance could be reversed, not by negotiation, but by dependency. To manage this operation, Britain relied on the British East India Company, an organization that functioned less like a business and more like a government that had accidentally discovered profit margins. It collected taxes, ran armies, administered territory, and now, very efficiently, sold narcotics to another empire. Officially, Britain claimed the opium trade was not its responsibility. The company was merely a commercial entity, after all. This was convenient, because it allowed British politicians to express concern while simultaneously counting the money. It was a masterclass in moral outsourcing. Opium was smuggled into China through coastal networks, bribed officials, and carefully maintained grey zones. Everyone involved knew it was illegal. Everyone involved also knew it was profitable. The Chinese state warned against it. Merchants ignored the warnings. Users multiplied. At first, the damage was subtle. A few addicts, a few corrupt officials, a few missing silver shipments. Nothing that looked like a crisis. yet. But addiction does not announce itself loudly. It creeps in quietly, settles comfortably, and only reveals its full cost when it is too late to stop. Britain had solved its trade problem. China had acquired a far worse one. And the empire that once believed it needed nothing was about to discover how expensive that confidence could be. At first, the opium problem did not look like a catastrophe. It rarely does. There were no dramatic collapses, no instant riots, no imperial alarms ringing across the capital. Instead, opium entered Chinese society the way most disasters do. Politely, gradually, and with a convincing sense of deniability. It began along the coast, among merchants, sailors, and dock workers. These were people already used to foreign goods and strange habits. A pipe here, a session there. No big deal. Officials assumed it would stay contained, limited to the rough edges of society where problems were expected to live anyway. Then it didn't. Opium crept inland, carried by traders who knew exactly where demand would bloom next. Scholars discovered it helped them relax after long hours of memorizing classical texts. Soldiers used it to dull boredom, pain, and the existential dread of standing guard for weeks at a time. Administrators, exhausted by paperwork and responsibility, found the pipe offered a gentle escape from reality and from accountability. This is where things became dangerous. When addiction reaches the ruling class, it stops being a social issue and starts becoming a structural one. Offices opened late, decisions were delayed, bribes became easier to offer and harder to refuse. A bureaucracy designed to function through discipline and moral authority began to wobble under the weight of human weakness. Families felt it next. Silver disappeared from households. Heirlooms were sold. Farmers neglected fields. Artisans missed deadlines. Productivity fell, not because people were lazy, but because addiction quietly rearranged priorities without asking permission. And the most alarming part? The silver. For centuries, China had carefully built an economy dependent on silver as its monetary backbone. Now that silver began flowing out of the country in massive quantities, sucked up by opium payments, the system strained. Prices rose, wages failed to keep up, taxes became harder to collect. The empire's financial arteries were being drained from the inside, yet many officials hesitated to act decisively. Why? Because admitting the scale of the problem meant admitting failure. It meant acknowledging that foreign merchants had outmaneuvered the Middle Kingdom using nothing but patience, profit, and human vulnerability. So reports were softened, numbers were delayed, blame was redirected. The hope was that the problem would somehow stabilize on its own. It wouldn't. Addiction does not stabilize. It spreads. And while China debated how serious the problem really was, the opium trade was already reshaping society, quietly, efficiently, and with devastating momentum. For centuries, silver had been the quiet hero of China's economy. It paid soldiers, funded public works, lubricated bureaucracy, and kept markets predictable. If the empire had a circulatory system, silver was the blood. And for a very long time, it flowed in exactly one direction, inward. Then, opium arrived, and the blood began flowing out. At first, the change was subtle. Merchants noticed that coins were a little harder to find. Local officials complained that tax payments were arriving late or partially missing. Nothing alarming, just enough to be irritating. But irritation in imperial systems is often the first symptom of disaster. Soon, the problem became impossible to ignore. Silver was leaving China in massive quantities, siphoned off to pay for opium imports. Farmers struggled to pay taxes because the metal they needed was suddenly scarce. Prices rose unpredictably, wages stagnated. Entire regions found themselves short on currency, which is never a great sign for a society built on monetary stability. And here's the truly painful irony. China had demanded silver for decades because it trusted silver. It was reliable, universal, stable. Now that same stability was working against it. There was no quick replacement, no alternative system ready to step in. You cannot simply announce, "We will be inventing a new economy next week." Officials scrambled to explain the situation without admitting how bad it really was. Reports were softened, numbers were massaged, blame was carefully redirected towards smugglers, corrupt local leaders, or moral decay among the population. Everyone was guilty. No one was responsible. Meanwhile, opium merchants were thrilled. The more silver left China, the more dependent the economy became. This wasn't just trade anymore. It was leverage. The Qing bureaucracy, famous for its precision and discipline, began missing deadlines. Soldiers were paid late. Infrastructure projects stalled. Trust in local administration weakened. And once people stopped trusting the system, they stopped cooperating with it. Still, many officials hesitated to act decisively. Why provoke foreign powers? Why risk instability? Why admit the empire had been outplayed by smugglers and merchants? Better to manage quietly. Better to wait. Better to hope. History is very unkind to hope without action. By the time the silver crisis was openly acknowledged, the damage was already systemic. The empire wasn't just losing money. It was losing control over the mechanisms that held it together. And that loss would soon demand a response far stronger than polite warnings. Eventually, even the most tradition-loving bureaucracy reaches its breaking point. For the Qing government, that moment arrived when the silver problem could no longer be explained away with polite memos and creative accounting. The economy was wobbling, officials were compromised, and the empire's moral authority was quietly evaporating. At this stage, denial stopped being an option and started being embarrassing. So the court did what empires usually do when subtlety fails. It panicked, regrouped, and decided to act very firmly. Opium was officially declared a serious national threat. Not a vice, not a bad habit, a full-scale crisis. Imperial edicts were issued banning its import, sale, and consumption. Officials were ordered to crack down on smugglers. Users were warned. Dealers were threatened. The message was clear. This was over. And for once, the government meant it. The Qing court appointed determined officials who actually intended to enforce the law, not just nod at it. Warehouses were searched. Smuggling networks were exposed. Coastal ports were inspected with an enthusiasm that smugglers found deeply inconvenient. Suddenly, the opium trade felt less like a clever business and more like a dangerous crime. The most dramatic moment came when massive quantities of confiscated opium were publicly destroyed. Tons of it. Enough to make smugglers cry quietly into their balance sheets. The opium was mixed with lime and seawater and dumped, deliberately and permanently. This was not subtle symbolism. This was the empire saying, "We are done." From the Chinese perspective, this was law enforcement, a sovereign state enforcing its own rules within its own borders. Perfectly reasonable, entirely legal, long overdue. From the British perspective, this was an outrage. Merchants howled, officials protested. Diplomats wrote very serious letters explaining that destroying opium was, somehow, unfair. Not immoral trade, not addiction, not smuggling. Destruction of property was the true crime here. This is where the situation crossed from internal crisis to international confrontation. China believed it was restoring order. Britain believed its profits were being attacked. And when empires disagree about money, philosophy tends to exit the conversation immediately. China assumed firmness would restore control. Britain assumed force would restore trade. Both sides believed they were defending justice. Only one side had steam-powered warships waiting offshore. And that imbalance was about to become painfully obvious. Britain did not respond to China's opium crackdown with self-reflection. There were no emergency meetings about ethics, no long walks along the Thames wondering if maybe selling narcotics to another civilization was a bad look. Instead, British officials reached for a far more familiar tool: naval power. The argument was simple, elegant, and deeply convenient. Britain claimed that China's destruction of opium was an attack on free trade. Not illegal trade, not smuggling, just trade. The fact that opium was banned under Chinese law was treated as a minor detail, the way a no swimming sign is treated right before someone dives in anyway. Diplomatic letters flew back and forth, each more offended than the last. Britain insisted that its merchants had rights. China insisted that its laws applied within its borders. One side believed sovereignty mattered. The other believed profit mattered more. This conversation was never going to end peacefully. So Britain sent ships, and modern ships, steam-powered, bristling with cannons, crewed by sailors trained for industrial warfare. When these vessels arrived off the Chinese coast, they represented a future that the Qing military was simply not prepared to fight. This was not courage versus cowardice. It was wood and sail versus iron and steam. Thus began the First Opium War, a conflict that was less a war and more a demonstration. Chinese forces fought bravely, often with outdated weapons and heroic optimism. British forces fought efficiently from a safe distance, with technology designed to remove romance from battle entirely. Coastal defences fell quickly. Forts were shelled into submission. Ports were blockaded. Each engagement sent a clear message. Resistance was admirable, but futile. Britain could strike where it wanted, when it wanted, and then politely request negotiations. Inside China, disbelief turned into panic. This was not how the world was supposed to work. For centuries, China had been the strongest power in its region. Now, foreign ships dictated terms from the sea, immune to traditional tactics and unimpressed by imperial authority. The war was short. The outcome was never in doubt. China sued for peace not because it accepted Britain's arguments, but because continuing the fight meant national collapse. The lesson was brutal. The opium trade had not only weakened China internally, it had exposed the empire to a world that no longer played by its rules, and the real damage was only just beginning. When the war ended, it did not end with celebration, reconciliation, or mutual understanding. It ended with paperwork. Very expensive paperwork. The kind of paperwork written while cannons are still warm and politely pointed at your coastline. China agreed to peace not because it believed it had lost the argument, but because it had lost the ability to continue the conversation without cities being shelled. The resulting agreement was framed as a treaty. In reality, it was a list of demands backed by naval artillery, which history later agreed to call unequal out of politeness. Ports that had once been tightly controlled were forced open to foreign trade. Tariffs, once set by the Chinese state, were now dictated externally. Foreign merchants gained legal protections that placed them beyond the reach of Chinese courts, and territory, actual land, was ceded as part of the deal, just to really underline the point. From Britain's perspective, this was a victory for free trade, stability, and international order. From China's perspective, it was an unthinkable humiliation. The empire that had managed foreign contact for centuries now found itself managed instead. Even worse, opium did not disappear. Despite all the talk of peace and regulation, the trade continued, larger, faster, and more openly than before. The war had not ended the problem, it had legitimized it. Smugglers became businessmen, illegal trade became tolerated trade. Addiction spread with less resistance than ever. Inside China, the psychological damage was immense. The state had enforced its laws, been punished for it, and emerged weaker than before. Officials were demoralized. The public was confused. If the government could not stop foreigners from selling poison within its borders, what exactly was it still in charge of? Trust eroded quickly. People began to whisper that the dynasty had lost the mandate of heaven, the traditional belief that justified imperial rule. Natural disasters, economic hardship, and foreign humiliation all fed the same conclusion. Something had gone terribly wrong at the top, and while the court tried to recover, to reform, to adapt, it did so under constant pressure. Foreign gunboats remained nearby. Merchants pushed for more access. Diplomats demanded further concessions. Peace had arrived, but it came with conditions. And every condition chipped away at sovereignty. The empire still stood, but it was standing on terms it no longer controlled. After the treaty, China did not suddenly collapse. That's important. Empires rarely fall dramatically in one clean moment. What China experienced instead was something far more exhausting. A slow, grinding loss of control disguised as international cooperation. The newly opened ports quickly became foreign islands on Chinese soil. Merchants arrived with legal protections that made them effectively untouchable by local authorities. If disputes arose, they were handled in foreign courts, under foreign laws, by foreign judges. China still owned the land, technically, but authority had packed its bags and moved out. Chinese officials found themselves in an impossible position. They were responsible for order, but lacked the power to enforce it. They were expected to collect taxes, but tariffs were now capped by foreign agreement. They were meant to regulate trade, but trade no longer listened. It was governance with all the responsibility and none of the authority, the worst possible arrangement. Opium flowed more freely than ever. The war had sent a clear message to smugglers. Resistance was dangerous, but persistence was profitable. Addiction deepened. Entire neighborhoods hollowed out. Productivity continued to fall. Families that had survived generations slipped into poverty in a single decade. Foreign merchants, meanwhile, thrived. They built warehouses, offices, and enclaves that operated like miniature cities. These areas were cleaner, better supplied, and suspiciously well protected. To Chinese observers, they looked less like trading posts, and more like previews of a future they hadn't agreed to. And here's where the humiliation really sank in. Chinese scholars and officials knew what was happening. They weren't ignorant. They could read reports, track silver flows, and observe social decay. But knowing something is wrong does not automatically grant you the power to fix it, especially when fixing it might trigger another naval visit. So reform stalled. Caution replaced decisiveness. Every decision was weighed against one terrifying question. Will this provoke another war? Governance slowed to a crawl. Innovation became risky. Stability became fragile. The people noticed. Trust in the dynasty weakened further. Rumors spread. Secret societies gained followers. Religious movements promised salvation, justice, or at least explanations. When a state cannot protect its citizens from foreign pressure or internal decay, citizens start looking elsewhere for meaning. China was not yet collapsing, but it was leaking. Authority, confidence, and cohesion. And leaks, if ignored long enough, always become floods. Once an empire loses control over its borders, its trade, and its dignity, the next thing to go is usually internal peace. And China, exhausted from foreign pressure and economic strain, was about to discover that internal collapse is far messier than external defeat. The countryside began to feel the damage first. Farmers struggled with rising taxes and falling incomes. Silver was scarce, officials were desperate, and corruption became less a moral failure and more a survival strategy. When local magistrates squeezed harder, peasants did not respond with loyalty. They responded with resentment, the quiet, patient kind that eventually explodes. Banditry increased. Secret societies flourished. Groups formed promising justice, protection, or spiritual salvation. Some offered all three, which made them extremely popular. When the state looks weak, alternatives start looking attractive, even if they come with matching uniforms and slightly unhinged leaders. Inside the Qing government, things weren't much better. Reformers argued that China needed to modernize, adopt new technology, rethink institutions, and maybe stop assuming the rest of the world would politely behave forever. Traditionalists argued that this thinking was dangerous nonsense, and that the real problem was moral decay, foreign influence, and insufficient respect for ancient values. These debates did not end quickly or productively. They dragged on while conditions worsened. Meetings were held. Memorials were written. Arguments were made with impressive calligraphy and absolutely no urgency. Meanwhile, villages burned, taxes went unpaid, and confidence in the system evaporated. The army, once a symbol of imperial stability, suffered badly. Soldiers were underpaid, poorly equipped, and increasingly tempted by desertion or rebellion. Loyalty is difficult to maintain when your salary is late and your government appears powerless. Even discipline began to fray, and perhaps most damaging of all was the loss of belief. For centuries, the Qing ruled under the idea that heaven favored their authority. When floods, famine, addiction, foreign humiliation, and internal chaos all arrived at once, people began to question whether heaven had quietly withdrawn its support. The mandate of heaven was not officially revoked. It never is, but it was definitely under review. By this point, the empire was no longer simply reacting to problems. It was drowning in them. Foreign powers watched closely. Rebels waited patiently, and the Qing state, stretched thin in every direction, was about to face a crisis so massive it would scar China for generations. If the Qing Empire had been limping before, this was the moment it collapsed onto the floor and politely asked history for a minute to breathe. What followed was not a minor uprising or a manageable revolt. It was one of the deadliest civil wars in human history, the Taiping Rebellion. It began, as many disasters do, with a man who believed he had a special message for the world. Hong Xiuquan failed the imperial examinations repeatedly, had a nervous breakdown, and emerged convinced he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ. This alone should have raised concerns. Instead, it became the foundation of a mass movement, fueled by desperation, poverty, and rage at a government that looked increasingly irrelevant. The Taiping movement promised equality, land reform, moral purification, and an end to corruption. To millions of peasants crushed by taxes, addiction, and economic collapse, this sounded fantastic. To the Qing government, it sounded like the end of everything, which, inconveniently, it almost was. Entire provinces fell out of imperial control. Cities were captured, bureaucrats fled, armies defected or disintegrated. The rebellion established its own capital and ruled vast territories for years. This was no fringe uprising. This was an alternative state growing inside the empire like a second skeleton. The Qing response was chaotic and brutally expensive. Loyalist armies were raised, often funded by local elites rather than the central government. Foreign powers, smelling opportunity, offered assistance at a price. The empire that once dictated terms now relied on outside help to survive its own civil war, and the human cost was unimaginable. Millions died from combat, famine, disease, and displacement. Entire regions were depopulated, agricultural systems collapsed, trade routes vanished. Even after battles ended, the damage lingered like a permanent scar. By the time the rebellion was finally crushed, the Qing dynasty technically survived. But in the same way a building survives after a fire, standing, blackened, hollow, and structurally unsound. The rebellion did not cause China's collapse. It revealed it. Opium, foreign pressure, economic failure, and political paralysis had weakened the empire. The Taiping Rebellion simply tore the curtain down and showed how fragile everything had become. And after this, recovery was no longer an option, only delay. After the rebellion was crushed, the Qing Empire still existed, which, under the circumstances, felt like an achievement worth applauding politely. The dynasty remained on the throne, officials returned to their desks, and the machinery of government creaked back into motion. On paper, the empire had survived. In reality, it was operating on borrowed time and borrowed confidence. The central government was exhausted. Financial reserves were gone. Military forces were depleted. Authority had been outsourced to local elites, who now expected rewards for saving the dynasty. The emperor still ruled, but increasingly through negotiation rather than command. Never a comforting sign for an absolute monarchy. Foreign powers noticed immediately. China's weakness was no longer theoretical. It was visible, tangible, profitable. Western nations pushed for more access, more ports, more rights, and more exemptions. Each demand was framed as reasonable. Each concession was described as temporary. None of them were ever reversed. The Qing court attempted reform, but cautiously, almost apologetically. New schools were discussed. Modern weapons were considered. Administrative changes were proposed, and then delayed, and then debated, and then quietly shelved, usually after someone asked whether reform might upset tradition, foreign powers, or both. This created a uniquely frustrating situation. Everyone agreed something needed to change, but no one agreed on what, how, or how fast. Reformers were accused of betraying Chinese values. Conservatives were accused of dooming the empire. Meetings were held. Papers were written. Very little happened. Meanwhile, opium addiction remained widespread. Even as officials condemned it, tax revenue quietly depended on it. Efforts to suppress it risked unrest. Efforts to tolerate it guaranteed decay. The state found itself trapped between morality and survival, and chose survival, slowly bleeding both. The people noticed. Faith in the dynasty continued to erode. Younger generations questioned why China, once the unquestioned center of civilization, now bent to foreign demands. Scholars debated how this had happened. Peasants didn't debate at all. They simply endured. What remained of Qing authority functioned more like damage control than governance. The goal was no longer greatness, stability, or renewal. It was simply avoiding collapse for another year. Then another. Then another. The empire was still standing, but no longer moving forward. And history is unforgiving to civilizations that stop moving. By the late 19th century, China found itself in a deeply humiliating position, still technically independent, yet increasingly treated like a shared workspace by foreign powers. No single nation had conquered China outright, but several had helpfully moved in, rearranged the furniture, and begun charging rent. Foreign influence spread through what were politely called spheres of influence. Different powers claimed economic privileges in different regions, building railways, controlling mines, managing ports, and dictating trade terms. China still had emperors, officials, and laws, but they operated in a landscape where key decisions required foreign approval, or at the very least, foreign tolerance. This arrangement was disastrous for sovereignty and confusing for everyone involved. Chinese officials were expected to maintain order in cities where foreigners answered only to their own courts. A Chinese magistrate could arrest a local citizen, but not a foreign merchant. Imagine being responsible for public safety, while half the population is legally untouchable. Authority does not thrive under those conditions. Economically, the damage deepened. Profits flowed outward. Infrastructure served foreign trade more than local needs. Chinese workers labored on projects that benefited outsiders, often under harsh conditions. The empire was no longer extracting value from its territory. It was watching value leave in an orderly, well-documented fashion. And yet, there was no dramatic moment of collapse, no final battle, no triumphant invasion, just a constant series of concessions, negotiations, and humiliations that wore the system down. Each agreement was described as temporary. Each compromise was framed as necessary. Together, they formed a permanent state of weakness. Reformers inside China grew more desperate. Some called for rapid modernization. Others demanded a return to tradition. A few suggested combining both, which pleased absolutely no one. The court tried to balance these competing visions while also avoiding another war, another rebellion, or another diplomatic crisis. It was like juggling while standing on a cracked floor. Public frustration mounted. Students protested. Intellectuals wrote furious essays. Secret societies whispered about revolution. The idea that the dynasty could restore China's strength began to feel less like hope and more like nostalgia. And through it all, the memory of opium lingered, not just as a drug, but as a symbol. It represented humiliation, exploitation, and the moment China realized the world had changed without asking permission. The empire still existed, but it no longer commanded respect. And once respect is gone, power usually follows. By the early 20th century, the Qing Empire was still alive in the same way an old house is still standing, upright, familiar, and quietly unsafe. There were no dramatic invasions sweeping across the capital. No single enemy delivered the final blow. Instead, the dynasty unraveled through exhaustion, loss of trust, and the creeping realization that no one truly believed in it anymore. The court attempted last-minute reforms with the energy of someone realizing the exam is tomorrow, and the textbook is still wrapped in plastic. New schools were introduced. Military modernization was discussed. Constitutional ideas were cautiously floated and then immediately surrounded by anxiety. Every reform felt both necessary and terrifying. Change might save the empire, but it might also finish it off. Officials hesitated. Delay became policy. Meanwhile, foreign influence was no longer shocking. It was normal. Foreign banks, railways, and concessions were part of daily life. Chinese citizens grew up in a country where outsiders enjoyed special privileges and local officials enforced rules they could not fully control. This wasn't just humiliating, it was corrosive. The people stopped expecting leadership from the dynasty. Loyalty turned into indifference. Indifference turned into frustration. Frustration slowly hardened into something far more dangerous. Readiness. Students organized. Intellectuals argued openly about revolution. Soldiers questioned why they should defend a system that could not pay them on time or protect national dignity. When authority dissolves quietly, rebellion does not need to shout. It just needs to wait. And the dynasty had no answer left. The emperor remained, ceremonies continued, and the bureaucracy still stamped documents with impressive seriousness. But belief, the invisible glue holding the system together, had vanished. The mandate of heaven was never officially revoked. It simply stopped being mentioned, which was far worse. When revolution finally came, it felt less like a storm and more like gravity. Provinces declared independence. Officials defected. The imperial center realized too late that it no longer commanded obedience, only habit. The Qing Dynasty fell not because it was conquered, but because it was abandoned. Opium had not destroyed the empire alone, but it had weakened society, drained the economy, invited foreign domination, and exposed every vulnerability at once. It turned confidence into complacency and strength into inertia. By the time the end arrived, no one was surprised, only tired. Looking back, the fall of China's greatest empire feels tragic not because it was inevitable, but because so much of it was avoidable. The Qing dynasty did not collapse because its people were weak, uneducated, or incapable. It collapsed because it faced a rapidly changing world with an old set of assumptions, and by the time those assumptions were challenged, the damage was already done. Opium did not destroy China in a dramatic, cinematic way. There was no single night when everything fell apart. Instead, it worked slowly, patiently, almost politely. It weakened bodies. It drained silver. It corroded trust. It softened resistance. By the time the empire realized what was happening, it was no longer fighting one problem. It was fighting all of them at once. Foreign powers did not need to conquer China outright. They simply waited. They watched as addiction hollowed out society, as trade imbalance flipped direction, as reforms stalled under fear and indecision. When they applied pressure, they found a system already tired, already divided, already unsure of itself. And here's the uncomfortable truth. The opium trade succeeded not just because Britain was aggressive, but because it understood something brutal about power. Power does not always need armies. Sometimes it just needs leverage, economic, social, psychological. Opium was leverage in its most cynical form. The Qing court believed stability was strength. In many eras, it had been. But in this one, stability without adaptation became stagnation. The empire tried to preserve order while the world rewrote the rules. It tried to manage foreign contact instead of understanding it. It tried to outweight change. History does not wait. And yet, there is something quietly admirable in how long China endured. Despite humiliation, rebellion, addiction, and foreign pressure, Chinese society did not disappear. It absorbed the shock. It fractured, suffered, and eventually rebuilt. The empire fell, but the civilization did not, which is more than many empires can say. If there is a final lesson here, it is this. No civilization collapses because of a single vice or a single enemy. Collapse happens when confidence turns into complacency, when power stops questioning itself, and when problems are allowed to grow quietly because confronting them feels uncomfortable. Opium did not just poison bodies, it exposed weakness. And once weakness is visible, the world moves in. That is how China's greatest empire fell, not with a final battle, but with a long, exhausted exhale. Amelia Earhart was not born into the sky. She was born into a world that very clearly told her to stay on the ground. Late 19th century America had firm ideas about what girls were meant to become, and none of them involved engines, windburn, or altitude. But even as a child, Amelia treated those expectations like loose suggestions rather than rules. She grew up climbing trees, building crude homemade roller coasters, and collecting newspaper clippings about women who dared to do unusual things. While other girls were encouraged toward manners and marriage, Amelia was busy breaking things, fixing them, and wondering how far she could push herself before the world pushed back. The sky at this stage was still just an idea, but the instinct was already there. Movement, freedom, distance. Her childhood was unstable. Financial struggles and family tensions forced frequent moves, and that sense of impermanence shaped her deeply. Home was not a fixed place. It was something temporary, something that could vanish. In hindsight, it is hard not to see how this fed her fascination with travel and escape. When nothing stays put, motion begins to feel safer than stillness. Amelia was intelligent, observant, and quietly rebellious. She did well in school, but never fully accepted the roles handed to her. She worked as a nurse's aide during the First World War, caring for wounded soldiers and witnessing firsthand what machines and modern warfare could do to the human body. It was here, surrounded by broken men and broken systems, that her sense of purpose sharpened. Life was fragile, time was limited, comfort was optional. Her first real encounter with aviation came not as a dramatic revelation, but as a slow burn. She saw planes at fairs, heard their engines, watched them wobble into the sky like stubborn insects. Early aircraft were loud, unreliable, and dangerous, which meant they were also perfect. They were not polite machines. They demanded courage, money, and mechanical understanding, all things women were told they lacked. Amelia saved obsessively, worked relentlessly, and ignored the raised eyebrows. She was not chasing glamour. She was chasing space, physical and psychological, in a world that kept shrinking women down. Long before she ever flew solo across an ocean, she had already made her most important journey, deciding that the ground was optional. Amelia Earhart did not step into aviation through an open door. She forced her way in through a side entrance, unpaid, uncelebrated, and largely unwanted. Flying in the early 1920s was expensive, dangerous, and dominated by men who believed gravity was sexist and ambition even more so. Amelia did not argue with them. She simply learned to fly anyway. Her first flight as a passenger was brief and unromantic. The plane rattled, the wind roared, and the pilot probably did not care whether she enjoyed herself. But something clicked. Not awe, not fear, recognition. This was what she had been looking for, not beauty, but control. The ability to lift yourself out of the ordinary world using skill and nerve alone. Flying lessons were brutally costly, so Amelia did what she always did. She worked. She took whatever jobs she could find, lived modestly, and treated every dollar as a future minute in the air. Her instructor was a woman, an exception in itself, and the lessons were practical rather than poetic. There was no romance in learning to land without dying, just repetition, discipline, and mistakes you survived long enough to correct. Early planes were unforgiving machines. No insulation, no comfort, barely any instruments. The cockpit was open to the elements, and the engine sat inches away, vibrating like it might detach out of spite. Pilots dressed for cold, not elegance. Goggles, scarves, leather, not for style, but for survival. This was not freedom without cost. It was freedom paid in bruises, fear, and constant risk. Amelia learned quickly, but she also learned realistically. She understood that talent alone would not carry her forward. Aviation required money, sponsorship, and publicity. Records mattered. Headlines mattered. If she wanted to stay in the air, she would have to become visible on the ground. This was a compromise she accepted, though never comfortably. She bought her first plane, bright yellow, slightly ridiculous, and deeply beloved. She named it, flew it hard, and pushed it higher than she was supposed to. Altitude records followed. Then, attention. Newspapers began to notice the novelty, a woman pilot who was not performing stunts for laughs, but treating aviation as serious work. Still, she was often introduced as an accessory rather than an aviator. Questions focused on her clothes, her smile, her nerves. She answered politely and returned to the cockpit. Every flight was an argument she did not need to voice. Each successful landing said enough. By the time she began setting records, Amelia was no longer asking permission. She had learned the machine, the sky, and the quiet truth beneath both. Confidence is built, not granted. Amelia Earhart did not become famous because she wanted to be admired. She became famous because aviation needed a symbol, and she happened to be useful. Her growing list of records and near records attracted attention at exactly the moment when long-distance flight was becoming a public obsession. Planes were no longer just machines, they were promises, and Amelia was shaped into one. Her sudden rise into the spotlight came with a peculiar imbalance. Newspapers celebrated her courage, but rarely her competence. She was framed as daring rather than disciplined, brave rather than skilled. When she crossed the Atlantic as a passenger on a transoceanic flight, headlines crowned her a heroine, even though she had not been at the controls. Amelia herself was deeply uncomfortable with this. She accepted the praise, smiled for photographs, and then privately dismissed the achievement as incomplete. Being famous for sitting still was not the goal. Publicity, however, brought resources. Sponsors emerged. Speaking tours followed. Amelia learned to stand on stages and talk about flight to audiences who had never left the ground. She used these moments carefully. Beneath the polite lectures was a quiet insistence. Women could do this too, if given training and trust. She never framed it as rebellion. She framed it as common sense, which was far more unsettling. Behind the scenes, fame was exhausting. She was expected to be inspirational at all times, composed, modest, grateful. Any display of ambition risked criticism. Any mistake risked being blamed not on the pilot, but on her gender. The margin for error was thinner for her than for any man sharing the same sky. Amelia understood this and adapted. She cultivated an image that was calm, capable, and deliberately plain. No theatrics, no arrogance. She dressed simply, spoke carefully, and redirected attention toward aviation itself. This was not humility, it was strategy. The less threatening she appeared, the farther she could go, yet the imbalance gnawed at her. She wanted to fly, not tour, to test limits, not repeat speeches. The more famous she became, the less time she spent in the air, and that contradiction sharpened her resolve. If the world was going to watch her, then she would give it something worth watching. Fame had found her first. Now she would decide what to do with it, and more importantly, how to escape it back into the sky. Amelia Earhart was determined to erase the asterisk next to her name. Being labelled the first woman to cross the Atlantic was flattering, but the quiet qualifier, passenger, lingered like turbulence. She wanted the record that mattered to her, alone, responsible for every decision, every correction, every consequence. Not symbolic flight, real flight. Planning a solo Atlantic crossing in the early 1930s was not optimism. It was audacity backed by preparation. The route was dangerous, the weather unpredictable, the navigation crude. There were no comforting instruments to lean on, no autopilot to save you when fatigue set in. Once airborne, the pilot became a small human problem suspended inside a larger mechanical one. Amelia knew this. She accepted it without dramatics, The plane was modified for endurance rather than elegance. Extra fuel tanks replaced comfort. Weight was calculated obsessively. Anything unnecessary was removed. The cockpit became a narrow space of noise, vibration, and isolation. This was not a journey meant to be enjoyed. It was meant to be completed. When she took off, there was no spectacle. Just an aircraft lifting into uncertain sky, carrying a woman who understood exactly what was at stake. Hours passed. Weather deteriorated. Ice formed on the wings. Instruments failed. At times she flew blind, trusting instinct, experience, and the thin line between caution and commitment. Fatigue crept in quietly. Muscles stiffened. Focus narrowed. The Atlantic offered no landmarks, no reassurance, just endless water below and an engine whose mood could change without warning. At any moment, a single failure could turn determination into disappearance. And yet, she persisted, not heroically, practically. Each problem was addressed as it arrived. When the plane struggled, she adjusted. When conditions worsened, she adapted. The flight was not a cinematic triumph. It was a sustained act of competence under pressure. When she finally landed on the far side of the ocean, there was relief rather than celebration. The record was hers now, undeniable, unqualified. She had done what she set out to do, not to prove a point to critics, but to herself. The world responded with applause, parades, and headlines. Amelia accepted them politely. But the real victory had already happened in the air, where no audience could interfere. She had taken full control of the aircraft, the narrative, and the meaning of her own ambition. Amelia Earhart emerged from her Atlantic triumph with something more complicated than victory. She was no longer just a skilled aviator. She had become a symbol whether she liked it or not. The public saw freedom, progress, and modernity stitched neatly into a leather jacket. Amelia saw a responsibility she had not actively sought, but refused to waste. With recognition came influence. Invitations arrived from universities, aviation groups, and political organizations. She accepted many of them, not out of obligation, but because she understood leverage when she saw it. If people were going to listen to her, she would say something useful. She spoke openly about opportunity, access, and the absurd waste of talent caused by excluding women from technical fields. Her arguments were calm, factual, and difficult to dismiss without sounding irrational. She helped found organizations dedicated to supporting female pilots, not as social clubs, but as professional networks. Training, shared resources, mentorship, practical tools rather than inspirational slogans. Amelia believed progress came from structure, not applause. You could not survive on admiration alone. You needed skills, backing, and people who took you seriously. At the same time, she continued flying. Records accumulated quietly: speed, distance, altitude. These achievements rarely received the same attention as her Atlantic flight, but they mattered to her. Each one reinforced her credibility. Each one kept her grounded in the work itself, rather than the image built around it. Her private life remained guarded. She valued independence fiercely and resisted expectations placed on her by fame and convention. Marriage, when it came, was approached as a partnership rather than a surrender. She insisted on autonomy, financial and personal, at a time when such demands were viewed as unsettling. She did not frame it as ideology. She framed it as fairness. This balance, public figure and private individual, was exhausting. The constant travel, the speeches, the expectations. Yet Amelia maintained a controlled calm. She rarely complained. She rarely dramatized. The pressure existed, but it did not define her. She understood that symbols eventually fade unless reinforced by action. So she kept flying, kept planning, kept looking beyond the horizon for something more demanding than comfort. Her ambitions were expanding again, stretching past oceans and continents. The sky had given her a voice. Now she was deciding how far to carry it, and how much risk she was willing to accept to stay ahead of her own legend. Amelia Earhart was never interested in repeating herself. Once a record became familiar, it lost its pull. The Atlantic was behind her now, and with it the comfort of proven routes and predictable headlines. What drew her forward were the blank spaces, the long stretches of the world still awkwardly connected by aviation, the routes that existed more in theory than practice. Long-distance flying in this era was not about glamour. It was logistics, endurance, and risk management stretched across thousands of miles. Amelia began planning flights that stitched continents together, tracing paths few pilots bothered to attempt. She flew across the Pacific, across the Americas, across regions where navigation depended more on judgment than instruments. Each journey was a lesson in humility. The sky did not care about reputation. The physical toll increased. Hours in the cockpit strained the body and dulled the senses. Weather delays turned schedules into guesses. Mechanical issues appeared far from spare parts and friendly runways. Amelia grew leaner, quieter, more focused. The casual charm that once defined her public image gave way to something sharper, a professional intensity that understood how thin the margin really was. She studied maps obsessively, not as abstractions, but as lived challenges. Wind patterns, fuel ranges, emergency landing options. Every line represented a decision she might have to make alone. This was where she felt most herself, planning against uncertainty, preparing for problems that had not yet arrived. At the same time, aviation itself was changing. Planes were improving, but not fast enough to eliminate danger. Radio communication remained unreliable. Navigation over water was still an exercise in estimation. Progress created opportunity, but not safety. Amelia accepted this without complaint. Risk was not an obstacle to ambition. It was the price. Friends and colleagues worried. The routes were longer now, the margins thinner. She listened, acknowledged their concerns, and continued planning. Fear, to her, was information. Something to account for, not something to obey. The more she flew, the clearer her next goal became. If aviation was going to mature, someone had to test its limits. Someone had to prove that global flight was not a novelty, but a future. And if the world insisted on watching her, then she would give it one last, unmistakable line across the map, even if that line ran straight through the most unforgiving skies on Earth. Amelia Earhart did not wake up one morning and casually decide to fly around the world. The idea formed gradually, like pressure building behind a sealed door. Aviation had advanced enough to make the attempt conceivable, but not enough to make it safe. That narrow gap between possible and foolish was exactly where Amelia tended to operate best. A circumnavigation near the equator would be longer, more complex, and less forgiving than any route she had flown before. It meant sustained endurance rather than a single dramatic crossing. Fuel logistics, international permissions, weather windows, navigation over open ocean, every variable multiplied. This was not a publicity stunt. It was a technical challenge disguised as an adventure. The aircraft was modified yet again. More fuel, more weight, more vulnerability. Every added mile of range increased strain on the machine and the pilot alike. Amelia knew this. She also knew that no amount of preparation could account for everything. At some point, planning had to give way to commitment. She chose a navigator, not as a safety net, but as a necessity. The route demanded expertise in celestial navigation, radio coordination, and constant recalculation. This was no longer a solo argument with the sky. It was a partnership against it. The early stages of the journey went well enough. Long flights, exhausting but manageable. Landfalls achieved, repairs made. The world followed closely, newspapers tracking her progress like a moving headline. Each successful leg reinforced the illusion of control, but beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Equipment issues appeared and disappeared unpredictably. Radio communication faltered. Weather grew less cooperative. Fatigue accumulated quietly. The most dangerous failure of all. Unlike engines, it did not announce itself. Still, Amelia pressed on. Turning back would not only end the attempt, it would leave the question unanswered. She had never been comfortable with unfinished sentences. As the flight approached the Pacific, vast, remote, and indifferent, the margins narrowed to almost nothing. Small islands became lifelines. Accurate navigation became survival rather than precision. The plan now depended on timing, clarity, and machines performing exactly as expected. It was here, at the edge of the map, that the story began to slip from certainty into silence. The sky she had conquered for so long was about to remind the world of its final authority. Amelia Earhart entered the final phase of her journey with no room left for error. The Pacific leg was not dramatic in appearance, just sky and water repeating endlessly, but it was the most technically unforgiving stretch of the entire flight. The destination was a tiny speck of land surrounded by thousands of miles of ocean. Missing it by even a small margin meant there would be nowhere else to go. Navigation depended on calculations made under strain. Clouds interfered with celestial fixes. Radio signals faded in and out, distorted by distance and atmosphere. Communication with support ships became uncertain, then fragmented. Each message carried urgency, but also confusion. The aircraft was burning fuel. Time was slipping. What happened next has been debated for decades because certainty vanished with the signal. Reports suggest difficulty finding the island, requests for direction, references to low fuel. Then, nothing. No final declaration. No confirmed position. Just silence, abrupt and absolute. The world reacted immediately. Search efforts were massive by the standards of the time. Ships and planes scoured vast areas of ocean. Coastlines were examined. Islands were inspected. The effort was expensive, urgent, and emotionally charged. But the Pacific does not yield easily. Days passed, then weeks. Hope thinned. Without physical evidence, theories multiplied. Mechanical failure, navigation error, emergency landing, capture, survival. Each possibility spawned its own arguments, fueled by incomplete data and human imagination. The absence of answers created a vacuum that speculation rushed to fill. What made the disappearance so haunting was not just the loss, but the mismatch between expectation and reality. This was a woman who had beaten distance repeatedly, who had treated the sky as something knowable. And yet, in the end, she vanished not in a storm of spectacle, but quietly, mid-task, mid-calculation. There was no heroic final image, no confirmed last words, just the unresolved space between effort and outcome. The disappearance did not erase her achievements, but it altered how they were remembered. The narrative shifted from mastery to mystery. The aviator became a question mark, suspended somewhere between legend and logistics. The silence over the Pacific was not dramatic. That was precisely why it endured. It reminded the world that even the most disciplined preparation could still end without resolution, and that the sky, no matter how familiar, never truly belonged to anyone. Amelia Earhart did not disappear from history when her plane vanished. In many ways, that moment fixed her in place permanently. The unanswered ending ensured that her life would never be neatly concluded, never filed away as a completed chapter. Instead, it remained open, inviting interpretation, debate, and projection. Searches eventually ended, but interest never did. Decades passed, and new technologies, new expeditions, and new theories continued to chase the same question across the same ocean. Each generation brought fresh confidence that it would finally solve the mystery. None did. The absence of certainty became part of the story itself, yet focusing solely on the disappearance risks missing the larger truth. Amelia Earhart's significance was not rooted in how her life ended, but in how deliberately she lived it. She treated ambition as a discipline rather than a spectacle. She prepared, calculated, adjusted, and accepted risk without romanticizing it. That mindset, calm persistence under pressure, is harder to mythologize than a dramatic crash, but far more instructive. Her impact on aviation was practical. She proved that long-distance flight was not reserved for a narrow type of person. She expanded who could be imagined in a cockpit, not through slogans, but through logged hours and completed routes. Organizations she helped establish continued to support pilots long after headlines faded. Structures outlived stories. Culturally, she became a shorthand for independence. Not because she rejected society outright, but because she navigated it on her own terms. She understood how systems worked and where they could be bent. She used visibility strategically, then returned to the work. That balance is easy to admire and difficult to replicate. The mystery surrounding her disappearance often overshadows her competence, but it does not diminish it. If anything, it reinforces the central lesson of her life. Progress happens at the edge of certainty, where outcomes are not guaranteed. Amelia Earhart did not seek immortality. She sought movement, distance, and mastery. The fact that her final flight ended without answers does not undermine that pursuit. It underscores it. The sky never gave her closure. History filled the silence instead, not with conclusions, but with endurance. And in that way, she never truly landed. Fashion does not begin with self-expression. It begins with survival. Long before clothes were judged for beauty, they were judged for usefulness, warmth, protection, and durability. But almost immediately, something else crept in. Meaning. Even the simplest garment began to say something about who you were, where you belonged, and how much power you carried. In ancient Egypt, this connection between clothing and status became unmistakable. Linen dominated daily life, spun from flax grown along the Nile. It was light, breathable, and perfectly suited to a hot climate. But not all linen was equal. The quality of the weave, the fineness of the thread, and the cleanliness of the cloth mattered deeply. Clothing was not just worn, it was displayed. Most people dressed simply. A basic wrap or kilt, practical and unadorned, signaled labor and obedience. The elite, however, wore linen so fine it was almost transparent, carefully pleated and bleached to radiant white. Cleanliness itself became a symbol of moral and social superiority. To appear unkempt was not just unattractive, it was suspect. Jewelry filled the gap where fabric stopped. Gold, beads, amulets, and coloured stones transformed otherwise minimal clothing into declarations of rank. These were not accessories for decoration alone. They were portable wealth, spiritual protection, and political messaging worn directly on the body. Even cosmetics played a role. Kohl-lined eyes were practical against glare and infection, but they also signaled refinement and divine favour. What matters here is not the look itself, but the logic behind it. Clothing already functioned as a visual language. You could read a person instantly, their occupation, their proximity to power, their access to resources. There was no illusion that fashion was personal. It was communal, hierarchical, and tightly controlled. This pattern would repeat across civilizations. Materials would change, styles would evolve, but the core idea remained stubbornly consistent. Clothes were never neutral. They marked boundaries between free and enslaved, sacred and ordinary, ruler and ruled. Fashion, from its very first chapter, was not about standing out. It was about being placed, visibly and unmistakably, within a social order. And once clothing learned to speak that language, it never forgot it. As societies grew more complex, clothing evolved from simple markers of status into instruments of discipline and identity. In ancient Greece, fabric did not merely cover the body, it trained it. Garments were designed to be worn correctly, and wearing them well signaled education, citizenship, and self-control. Greek clothing relied heavily on draped forms rather than tailored shapes. The chiton and hermation were rectangles of cloth, fastened and folded rather than cut. This simplicity was deceptive. To wear these garments properly required knowledge, how to fold, where to pin, how to move without disorder. A citizen's clothing was expected to appear effortless, but effort lay beneath every fold. The body itself mattered. Greek ideals prized proportion, balance, and restraint, and clothing was designed to echo those values. Excessive ornamentation was frowned upon. Simplicity suggested virtue. Bright dyes and luxurious fabrics existed, but they carried social implications. Too much display hinted at foreign influence, moral weakness, or a lack of discipline. Across the Mediterranean, ancient Rome took these ideas and formalized them. Clothing became law. The toga was not merely traditional attire, it was a legal marker of citizenship. Only free male citizens could wear it, and even then there were rules. Different togas signaled different ranks, offices, and stages of life. You did not choose your toga. Your status chose it for you. Roman clothing was intentionally cumbersome. The toga was heavy, restrictive, and impractical. That was the point. Physical labor was incompatible with political authority. A man who could move easily was expected to work. A man draped in layers of wool was expected to rule. Clothing enforced hierarchy by limiting the body itself. Women's clothing followed its own strict codes, signaling respectability, marital status, and family honor. Deviating from these expectations invited scrutiny or suspicion. Fashion here was less about creativity and more about compliance. In both Greece and Rome, clothing acted as public shorthand. It identified who mattered, who belonged, and who could be ignored. Style was not fluid. It was controlled, inherited, and policed. The classical world perfected a dangerous idea. That power should look a certain way, calm, draped, restrained. And that deviation from this visual code was not just unfashionable, but uncivilized. When the classical world fractured, fashion did not disappear. It retreated inward. In medieval Europe, clothing became less about public citizenship and more about spiritual position. The body was no longer something to be celebrated or displayed. It was something to be disciplined, hidden, and controlled. Fabric followed belief. Christian theology reshaped how people dressed. Modesty was elevated to virtue, and excess became suspicion. Loose, layered garments concealed the body's shape, minimizing individuality in favor of moral uniformity. To dress too boldly was to risk accusations of vanity, pride, or worse. Clothing now answered not only to society, but to God. Yet hierarchy did not vanish. It merely changed language. Laws known as sumptuary laws dictated what different classes were allowed to wear. Certain colors, fabrics, and embellishments were restricted to the nobility. Purple, fur, and finely dyed cloth became legal symbols of privilege. Wearing what you were not entitled to could result in punishment. Fashion became enforceable obedience. Monastic clothing pushed restraint even further. Simple habits erased personal identity entirely, replacing it with communal belonging. Rough fabric, muted colors, and repeated forms reinforced humility and submission. To look the same as everyone else was the point. Distinction was a sin. At the same time, the elite dressed with calculated excess. Heavy velvets, layered furs, and elaborate embroidery declared power not through elegance, but through weight and cost. These garments were uncomfortable by design. They announced that the wearer did not labor, did not rush, and did not bow easily. Clothing slowed the body and elevated the wearer above daily struggle. Women's fashion reflected additional pressures. Clothing emphasized chastity and obedience, with veils, long sleeves, and structured layers that restricted movement. Hair was hidden, silhouettes were controlled. The body was managed as a moral object rather than an expressive one. Color itself carried meaning. Black signaled seriousness and authority. White suggested purity. Red could imply wealth, sin, or danger depending on context. Nothing was neutral. Medieval fashion tells a quieter story than classical drapery, but a stricter one. Clothing became a visible moral contract. To dress incorrectly was not merely inappropriate, it was threatening. Faith and fear were woven tightly together, and fabric became the front line where belief, power, and control met. The Renaissance did not reject medieval values so much as renegotiate them. As Europe's cities grew wealthier and more self-confident, clothing began to change shape, literally. Fabric once used to conceal the body was now cut, padded, and structured to emphasize it. Fashion turned outward again, and the human form returned to the center of attention. Tailoring transformed clothing from draped layers into engineered silhouettes. Sleeves were slashed and puffed, revealing expensive inner fabrics beneath. Doublets and gowns were stiffened, widened, and shaped. The body became a framework for displaying wealth, skill, and ambition. Clothing no longer whispered obedience, it announced presence. This was not vanity alone. The Renaissance celebrated human achievement. Art, science, politics, and fashion mirrored this confidence. To dress well was to declare participation in a new world driven by intellect and enterprise rather than pure inheritance. Merchants dressed like nobles. Nobles dressed to stay ahead of merchants. Fashion became competitive. Fabric itself grew more elaborate. Silk, velvet, brocade, and lace flooded European markets, fueled by expanding trade routes. Colors deepened as dye technology improved. Rich reds, blues, and greens became attainable for those with money, not just titles. Wealth began to challenge birthright, yet control remained. Sumptuary laws persisted, struggling to keep up with social change. Clothing exposed tension between tradition and mobility. The law tried to freeze society in place. Fashion kept moving. Men's clothing emphasized authority and structure. Broad shoulders, narrow waists, and stiff collars created a commanding silhouette. Power was built into the garment itself. Women's fashion followed a different logic. Corsets and bodices reshaped the torso into idealized forms, enforcing beauty through restriction. Clothing celebrated the body while simultaneously controlling it. Accessories multiplied. Hats, gloves, ruffs, and jewelry completed the performance. Every detail was intentional. Nothing was accidental. The Renaissance also elevated the artist and the tailor. Craftsmanship became visible. Clothing was no longer just worn. It was admired as a technical achievement. Skill itself became fashionable. In this era, fashion became personal again, but not free. It reflected ambition, anxiety, and competition in equal measure. The body returned to view, but only after being disciplined, reshaped, and turned into a statement. The Renaissance dressed the human figure as a work of art, impressive, constrained, and constantly judged. As Europe moved into the early modern period, fashion became louder, heavier, and far less subtle. Clothing was no longer just about wealth or refinement. It became a political instrument. Nowhere was this clearer than at the royal courts, where dress was transformed into spectacle and authority, stitched itself into every seam. At the center of this transformation stood Louis XIV, who understood something crucial. Power must be seen to be believed. At his court, fashion was tightly controlled, extravagant, and deliberately impractical. Towering wigs, embroidered coats, silk stockings, and heeled shoes turned the male body into a moving display of dominance. These clothes restricted movement on purpose. A king who could barely walk did not need to run. Court dress became a uniform of obedience. Nobles were expected to appear in specific styles, colors, and fabrics, all regulated by royal taste. To fall behind in fashion was to fall behind politically. To be excluded from court dress was to be excluded from influence. Clothing functioned as social surveillance. Women's fashion reached new extremes. Dresses widened into architectural forms, supported by layers of understructure. Movement became slow, ceremonial, and controlled. The body was less a person than a platform for displaying wealth, lineage, and alliances. Comfort was irrelevant. Visibility was everything. Luxury materials dominated. Silk, lace, gold thread, and imported dyes. These were not simply expensive. They were intentionally wasteful. Excess proved abundance. The ability to wear something impractical demonstrated that labor was someone else's problem. This era also solidified fashion's relationship with imitation. Courts across Europe copied each other obsessively. Style traveled faster than armies. To dress like the French court was to signal sophistication and power, even when the wearer had neither. Fashion here was no longer just personal or cultural. It was administrative. It organized hierarchy, enforced loyalty, and made inequality visible. Clothing told everyone exactly where they stood. The theater of power reached its peak in fabric and form. Fashion was no longer about protecting the body or celebrating it. It was about overpowering it, transforming human figures into symbols that could be read instantly and obeyed without question. The explosion of excess eventually provoked its opposite. When political revolutions shook Europe, fashion changed with them, quickly, aggressively, and with intent. Clothing became a declaration of ideology. What you wore now announced not just wealth, but allegiance. In late 18th century France, luxury became dangerous. Silk, lace, and powdered wigs, once symbols of refinement, turned into liabilities. They marked the wearer as complicit in inequality. Fashion reversed course almost overnight. Simplicity became virtue. Restraint became power. Men abandoned ornate court dress in favor of dark coats, plain trousers, and practical shoes. This was not modesty for comfort's sake. It was visual politics. Clothing modeled seriousness, rationality, and moral equality. The decorated body was suspect. The restrained body was trustworthy. Women's fashion shifted too, drawing inspiration from classical antiquity. High-waisted gowns, light fabrics, and minimal ornamentation replaced heavy structures. The look suggested naturalness and freedom, even as social expectations remained strict. Fashion promised liberation more readily than it delivered it. Color became ideological. Bright hues associated with aristocracy fell out of favor. Neutral tones communicated virtue and discipline. To dress plainly was to claim moral superiority over the fallen elite. Clothing became a public argument. Beyond France, industrialization accelerated these changes. Mass production made clothing cheaper and more accessible. Fashion was no longer confined to courts and cities. It spread into factories, offices, and streets. The suit emerged as a uniform of professionalism, efficiency, and authority. Its clean lines concealed class differences while quietly reinforcing them. Gender distinctions hardened. Men's fashion narrowed into repetition. Women's fashion remained expressive but constrained, balancing ornament with social control. Dress codes emerged, formalizing respectability through fabric. This era redefined rebellion. You no longer needed excess to signal power. You needed restraint, control, uniformity. The most radical thing you could wear was something that refused spectacle. Fashion, once again, mirrored society's anxieties. As political structures shifted, clothing absorbed the shock. It simplified, standardized, and disciplined the body anew. The revolution did not free fashion. It repurposed it. Clothes stopped performing monarchy and started performing modernity. Serious, rational, and quietly authoritative. As the 19th century progressed, fashion tightened its grip on the body once again, not through spectacle, but through morality. Industrialization transformed how clothes were made, sold, and worn. At the same time, social values hardened around respectability, discipline, and visible self-control. Clothing became a moral surface. Factories flooded cities with affordable garments. Ready-made clothing replaced bespoke tailoring for much of the population. Fashion accelerated, trends spread faster, uniformity increased. But this accessibility came with rules. To dress improperly was to signal moral failure rather than poor taste. The silhouette of the era reflected these anxieties. Men's fashion became rigid and repetitive. Dark suits, stiff collars, controlled shapes. Authority was sober, restrained, and predictable. Individuality was discouraged. Seriousness became the ideal. To dress loudly was to lack discipline. Women's fashion told a more complicated story. The body was reshaped dramatically through corsets, bustles, and layers of structure. These garments enforced posture, limited movement, and idealized fragility. Clothing claimed to protect women while physically constraining them. Respectability required discomfort. At the same time, fashion reinforced gender roles visually. Men moved freely. Women occupied space carefully. Clothing trained behavior as much as appearance. Fashion became a tool for social instruction. Color followed moral logic. Black signaled seriousness and virtue. Excessive decoration invited suspicion. Even leisure clothing was carefully coded. There were rules for every context: public, private, formal, informal. To know these rules was to belong. Yet beneath this surface of restraint, tension built. The same industrial systems that produced modest clothing also created wealth, mobility, and urban anonymity. New social classes emerged. Fashion began to fragment. The first cracks appeared. Women adopted simplified garments for work and movement. Sportswear emerged. Rational dress movements questioned restrictive clothing. These were not yet revolutions, but pressure points. Victorian fashion reveals a society obsessed with control over bodies, behavior, and appearances. Clothing functioned as armor against chaos, signaling order in a rapidly changing world. But control breeds resistance. And as the century closed, fashion stood on the brink of rebellion, ready to loosen, shorten, and finally breathe again. The early 20th century did not politely adjust fashion. It dismantled it. War, urban life, and shifting social roles made the old silhouettes feel absurd. Clothing that restricted movement no longer matched a world defined by speed, machinery, and disruption. Fashion responded by cutting itself loose. Women's clothing changed first and decisively. Corsets loosened, then disappeared. Hemlines rose. Fabrics softened. Clothing began to accommodate movement rather than suppress it. This was not simply aesthetic change. It reflected a deeper shift in how bodies were allowed to exist in public space. Designers like Coco Chanel rejected ornament in favor of simplicity. Jersey fabrics, clean lines, and neutral colors replaced excess. Comfort became fashionable, which would have sounded like heresy a generation earlier. Clothing no longer tried to overpower the wearer. It worked with them. Men's fashion changed less dramatically, but the uniformity of the suit began to loosen. Sportswear, casual wear, and functional clothing entered everyday life. The distinction between work and leisure blurred. Clothing adapted to motion, travel, and informal interaction. War accelerated everything. Scarcity forced minimalism. Utility replaced decoration. When materials were limited, extravagance looked offensive. Afterward, fashion did not return fully to excess. It had learned efficiency. Cities became laboratories for style. In places like Paris and New York, fashion reflected modern identity. Fast, fragmented, and experimental. Clothing became a way to navigate anonymity. You could reinvent yourself through what you wore. Mass media amplified change. Films, magazines, and advertisements spread styles instantly. Fashion no longer trickled slowly from elites downward. It circulated, collided, and recombined. Trends shortened. Authority dissolved. Gender boundaries softened visually. Women borrowed from men's wardrobes. Men adopted relaxed silhouettes. Clothing stopped insisting on rigid roles, even if society still did. Fashion in the modern era embraced contradiction. It promised freedom while responding to pressure. It simplified while multiplying options. It rejected old rules without offering permanent replacements. What emerged was not a single style, but a condition. Constant change. Fashion became a conversation rather than a command. Unstable, expressive, and increasingly personal. The body was no longer dressed to obey. It was dressed to move, adapt, and survive a world that refused to stand still. By the late 20th century, fashion stopped pretending it could speak for everyone. Instead of enforcing order, it fractured into voices, loud, contradictory, and deliberately confrontational. Clothing was no longer trying to reflect society. It was trying to argue with it. subcultures took control. In post-war cities, young people used clothing to reject the values they inherited. In London, punk stripped fashion down to provocation. Torn fabric, safety pins, leather, and aggressive silhouettes rejected polish entirely. These clothes were not designed to last. They were designed to offend, to expose systems that felt rotten beneath the surface. Fashion became refusal. Other movements followed different paths. Streetwear emerged from marginalized communities, built around practicality, visibility, and coded belonging. Logos replaced tailoring, sneakers replaced formal shoes. Clothing spoke in signals: who you listened to, where you came from, what you resisted. Identity became layered and portable. High fashion responded by absorbing rebellion. Designers pulled subcultural aesthetics onto runways, transforming protest into product. This cycle, resistance, absorption, repetition, became fashion's new rhythm. Nothing stayed outside the system for long. Technology accelerated everything. Global production, fast fashion, and digital media collapsed time and distance. Trends rose and fell in months, sometimes weeks. Clothing lost permanence. The idea of a stable style dissolved. You could reinvent yourself constantly, cheaply, and publicly. At the same time, fashion became more personal and more political. Choices about clothing began to signal beliefs: sustainability, gender expression, cultural identity. Traditional categories blurred. Masculine and feminine mixed freely. Vintage coexisted with synthetic. The body became a canvas rather than a template, but freedom came with consequences. Overproduction hollowed meaning. Choice became overwhelming. Fashion promised individuality while delivering uniformity at scale. The same tools that enabled self-expression also flattened it. The history of fashion ends not with resolution, but with tension. Clothing still tells stories of power, rebellion, and belonging. But now those stories overlap, conflict, and change constantly. From linen wraps to leather jackets, fashion has always been about more than fabric. It has been about who gets to be seen, who gets to decide, and how loudly a body is allowed to speak. Long before music became an art, rhythm was an instinct. The earliest drums were not invented, they were discovered. Humans noticed that striking a hollow object produced a sound that travelled farther than the voice and lasted longer than a shout. That sound carried authority. It demanded attention. It echoed something already familiar, the steady pulse inside the chest. The first drums were crude by necessity and powerful by effect. Hollowed logs, stretched animal skins, gourds, clay vessels, even the ground itself became instruments. Hands, sticks, and feet provided the technique. There was no separation between musician and audience because drumming was communal by design. Everyone felt it. Everyone moved to it. Rhythm did not need translation. Drumming served purposes far more serious than entertainment. It synchronized group activity: walking, rowing, working, hunting. A shared beat aligned bodies into a single unit. In dangerous environments, coordination meant survival. Rhythm created order where chaos threatened. But drums also crossed into the invisible. The repetitive pulse altered perception, pulling listeners into trance-like states. This made drums essential to ritual. They marked transitions: birth, death, initiation, mourning. The beat connected the physical world to something unseen, whether spirits, ancestors, or collective memory. In many cultures, the drum was not considered an object, but a living presence. Unlike melodic instruments, drums demanded no tuning to nature's scales. They spoke directly to the nervous system, loud enough to summon, steady enough to command, flexible enough to signal. A change in rhythm could warn of danger, announce celebration, or enforce authority. The drum became an early form of language, abstract, but universally understood. What makes drums unique is their inevitability. Every culture developed them independently, not because of imitation, but because rhythm is embedded in biology. Heartbeats, footsteps, breathing. The body is already a percussion instrument. Drums externalized what humans already were. There was no elite class of drummers at first. Rhythm belonged to everyone. It was shared, repeated, inherited. Children learned it before words. Elders preserved it through repetition rather than notation. Knowledge lived in the hands, not on the page. This is where the history of drums truly begins. Not in courts or concert halls, but around fires, in open spaces, among people who understood something fundamental. Before humans learned how to sing together, they learned how to beat time together. The drum was the first instrument because it was the first truth. As human societies settled and grew more complex, drums moved from instinctive tools into sacred instruments. In the earliest civilizations, rhythm became formalized, regulated, and infused with spiritual authority. Drums were no longer just beaten, they were invoked. In ancient Mesopotamia, percussion accompanied temple rituals and royal ceremonies. Drums marked offerings to the gods, processions through cities, and the presence of authority. Their sound was believed to travel beyond human ears, carrying prayers upward and summoning divine attention. Silence, in these moments, was not neutral. It was dangerous. In ancient Egypt, drums held a similarly sacred role. Frame drums and barrel-shaped drums appeared in religious festivals, funerary rites, and celebrations honoring the gods. Rhythm guided dancers, priests, and participants into coordinated movement, reinforcing cosmic order. The idea that society, nature, and the divine were meant to move in harmony. Drums also became instruments of power. In early states, sound controlled space. A drum beat could command attention across crowds long before written announcements or amplified speech. Leaders understood this instinctively. Ritual drumming framed authority as something sanctioned not just by people, but by the heavens. In many cultures, the drum itself was sacred. Materials mattered. Animal skins were chosen carefully, often from creatures associated with strength, fertility, or protection. The act of making a drum could involve ritual preparation, offerings, or purification. The instrument was believed to contain spirit, memory, or ancestral presence. To strike it incorrectly was not merely a musical error. It was a breach of respect. Drumming also regulated time. Festivals followed rhythmic cycles. Ceremonies unfolded according to beats rather than clocks. Repetition anchored memory in societies without written records. Rhythm preserved tradition. Unlike melodic instruments reserved for trained specialists, drums remained communal, even as societies stratified. While priests or musicians might lead, participation was collective. The beat invited response. It was inclusive by nature. What distinguished early civilization drumming from prehistoric rhythm was intention. The beat now meant something specific. It signaled sacred moments, reinforced hierarchy, and stabilized belief systems. Rhythm became architecture for society, invisible but foundational. As civilizations expanded, drums traveled with them. Trade, conquest, and migration carried rhythms across regions. where they adapted without losing their core power. The drum had become more than a heartbeat. It had become a bridge between humans and gods, order and chaos, sound and meaning. As societies expanded beyond villages and cities, drums acquired a new, harsher role. They became tools of coordination in conflict, instruments that could move bodies across distance, impose order in chaos, and turn sound into command. On the battlefield, rhythm was authority. In ancient China, large war drums were used to signal advances, retreats, and formations. The beat replaced speech, cutting through noise and confusion. Soldiers trained to respond instinctively to rhythm, not words. A single pattern could mobilize thousands. Silence, again, was never accidental. Across ancient India, drums accompanied armies and royal processions alike. Percussion announced power before it arrived. The sound of drums rolling across open land was psychological warfare. It warned enemies, energized troops, and framed combat as ritualized duty rather than chaos. Drums excelled at distance. Before flags, horns, or radios, rhythm traveled reliably through air and terrain. Unlike speech, it could not be misunderstood linguistically. The body recognized it immediately. Fast meant urgency. Slow meant control. Repetition meant order. Change meant danger. In many cultures, drummers held protected status within armies. They were not simply musicians. They were tactical assets. To silence an enemy's drums was to disrupt command itself. To lose your own meant confusion, panic, and collapse. Beyond battle, drums structured civic life. They announced curfews, assemblies, executions, and celebrations. Cities pulsed to regulated sound. Time was kept by rhythm rather than clocks. The drum governed daily movement. Yet even in war, drums retained symbolic weight. Beating the drum before battle invoked ancestral protection and moral justification. Conflict was framed as necessary, sanctioned, and meaningful. Rhythm made violence feel ordered. This dual nature, sacred and brutal, defined the drum's expanding identity. It could summon gods or summon soldiers. It could heal or terrify. The same instrument served both altar and battlefield without contradiction. As empires collided, rhythms crossed borders. Military drumming styles influenced one another, evolving through contact and conquest. Patterns became sharper, louder, more standardized. Precision mattered. By this stage, drums were no longer communal in the old sense. They were specialized, disciplined, and strategically deployed. Rhythm had become a language of power, one that could organize belief, enforce obedience, and move history forward with a beat that could be felt long before it was understood. While many civilizations used drums to project authority from the top down across much of Africa, drumming evolved in the opposite direction, outward from the community itself. Here, drums were not background instruments or tools of command. They were voices. To understand African drumming is to understand rhythm as social structure. In many African societies, drums functioned as a form of speech. Tonal languages allowed rhythms to mimic the rise and fall of words, turning drums into communicative tools. Messages could be sent across villages, announcements, warnings, celebrations, even personal names. The drum did not accompany language, it became language. Drumming marked every stage of life. Birth, initiation, marriage, harvest, mourning. Each moment had its own rhythms, patterns learned through repetition and memory rather than written instruction. To know the rhythms was to know your place within the community. Music was not separated from daily life. It was embedded in it. Unlike hierarchical court or military drumming, African percussion emphasized dialogue. Call and response patterns created conversation rather than command. One drummer spoke, another answered. Dancers responded with movement. The audience was never passive. Participation was expected. Rhythm created belonging. The instruments themselves varied widely. Djembes, talking drums, dunan, frame drums, each carried regional identity. Materials were local. Construction followed tradition. The act of making a drum was often ritualized, acknowledging the instrument's role as more than an object. A drum could represent lineage, history, and collective memory. Drummers held respected but grounded positions in society. They were historians, messengers, and mediators. Through rhythm, they preserved stories, genealogies, and moral lessons. Where written records were absent, drums remembered. This deep integration made drums inseparable from identity. Rhythm distinguished one group from another. It marked territory without borders. When people migrated, the rhythms traveled with them, adapting without disappearing. This tradition would later reshape global music in ways that are impossible to overstate. As African peoples were displaced through trade and enslavement, their rhythms survived even when instruments were stripped away. Hands, feet, and voices carried the beat forward. What makes African drumming unique is not complexity alone, but philosophy. Rhythm was not decoration, it was structure. Time itself was experienced as layered, cyclical, and shared. The drum here was not an authority imposed from above. It was the sound of community thinking out loud, together, in time, without separation between music and life. When African rhythms were torn from their homelands through forced migration, the drum became dangerous. In many parts of the Americas and the Caribbean, colonial authorities quickly realized what rhythm could do. Drums gathered people. Drums coordinated movement. Drums remembered things that power preferred forgotten. So drums were banned, but rhythm did not disappear. It adapted. Enslaved communities were often forbidden from owning or playing drums, especially after uprisings where percussion had been used to communicate and organize. Silence was enforced, but only on the surface. The body became the instrument. Hands clapped, feet stomped. Voices layered rhythm into work songs, spirituals, and chants. The beat survived by hiding in plain sight. In places like the Caribbean and the Brazil, drumming traditions were disguised within religious practice. Percussion became prayer. Rhythms were embedded into ceremony, masked as worship, while preserving ancestral memory. The drum was no longer always visible, but it was always present. Improvised instruments filled the gaps. Barrels, boxes, bones, tools. Anything that could produce sound became part of the rhythmic arsenal. What mattered was not the object, but the pattern. Rhythm proved more resilient than material. In the United States, this transformation shaped entirely new musical forms. Work rhythms synchronized labor under brutal conditions. Spirituals encoded hope and resistance beneath religious language. Later, these rhythmic foundations would give rise to blues, jazz, and eventually modern popular music. Even when melody changed, percussion carried the memory forward. What emerged from this period was not loss, but evolution. Rhythm absorbed trauma and converted it into structure. It became a way to endure without erasing identity. The drum, stripped from the hands, reappeared in the body itself. This history matters because it explains why percussion in the modern world often carries emotional weight beyond sound. Drums do not just entertain, they remember. They carry histories of control, resistance, and survival. When drums eventually returned openly, in festivals, ceremonies, and music, they came back transformed, louder, layered, defiant. This chapter of drumming history is not about instruments advancing or techniques improving. It is about rhythm refusing to die. Even when stripped of wood and skin, the beat stayed alive, tapping through generations, waiting for the moment it could once again be struck openly, without fear. As rhythm survived through adaptation and resistance elsewhere, Europe took a different path. Drums there were absorbed into systems, military, religious, and eventually artistic, where precision mattered more than communal expression. Percussion became regulated, standardized, and disciplined. In medieval and early modern Europe, drums were tightly linked to armies. Side drums set marching pace, enforced timing, and imposed unity on large groups of soldiers. Rhythm trained bodies to move as one. Unlike African call and response traditions, European military drumming demanded obedience, not dialogue. The beat was fixed, deviation was error. This approach carried into ceremonial life. Church music used percussion sparingly, but rhythm still structured time. Bells marked hours. Processional beats ordered movement. Sound controlled space and behavior. Music reinforced hierarchy. As orchestral music developed, drums entered a new environment. In courts and concert halls, percussion became a supporting force rather than a leading voice. Timpani, bass drums, and auxiliary percussion emphasized drama, tension, and resolution. They did not speak freely. They obeyed the score. The orchestra transformed drums into symbols of power rather than participation. A single strike could signal danger, triumph, or fate itself. But that strike was carefully placed. Improvisation disappeared. Precision ruled. This shift reflected broader cultural values. Western music increasingly prized notation, control, and authorship. Rhythm was something to be written, rehearsed, and repeated exactly. The drummer became a specialist rather than a communal figure. At the same time, new instruments emerged. Advances in metalworking and tuning allowed drums to produce consistent pitch and volume. Percussion grew louder, deeper, more controlled. The chaotic pulse of earlier eras was reshaped into disciplined force. This transformation was not neutral. By placing rhythm inside rigid systems, Europe separated drums from their social roots. Percussion became something to listen to rather than something to join. The audience was expected to remain still. Yet something was lost in the process. Drums gained precision, but lost flexibility. They gained respectability, but lost intimacy. Rhythm was no longer a shared experience. It was a performance. This tension would not last forever. As the modern world accelerated, the strict order of orchestral percussion began to feel constraining. New spaces, new cultures, and new technologies would soon pull drums back out of the score and into the street. The stage was set for rhythm to break free again, louder, looser, and impossible to contain. The rigid discipline of Western percussion could not survive contact with the modern city. As cultures collided in ports, factories, and neighborhoods, rhythm slipped its leash. Drums moved out of the orchestra pit and into crowded rooms where rules bent under pressure. This was not refinement. This was release. In places like New Orleans, African rhythmic memory met European instruments and American realities. Marching drums, church rhythms, work songs, and street parades overlapped daily. Out of this collision came syncopation, rhythm that leaned forward, pulled back, and refused to land where expected. The beat stopped obeying the grid. Early jazz drummers were not timekeepers alone. They were conversationalists, using snare, bass drum, cymbals, and whatever else was available, they layered rhythms that danced around melody rather than beneath it. The drum kit itself was a practical invention. Multiple percussion voices controlled by one body. Efficiency turned into expression. Improvisation returned. Unlike orchestral percussion, jazz drumming demanded constant decision-making. Every performance was different. The drummer listened, responded, provoked. Rhythm became interactive again, closer to its communal roots than anything Western music had allowed in centuries. This shift changed how drums were perceived. They were no longer background support. They shaped momentum, mood, and tension. A single break could redirect an entire piece. Silence mattered as much as sound. Space became rhythmic. As jazz evolved, so did drumming. Swing loosened the beat. Bebop fragmented it. The drummer stopped marking time and started suggesting it. Rhythm became elastic. Authority dissolved into collaboration. This freedom carried forward. Rhythm and blues, rock, funk, all inherited the idea that drums could lead rather than follow. Backbeats emphasized groove over order. The body returned to the center of music. People danced again, not politely, but instinctively. Technology amplified everything. Microphones made subtle playing audible. Recordings preserved style and spread influence globally. Drummers were studied, copied, idolized. Rhythm became personality. What jazz restored was not just complexity, but attitude. The drum reclaimed its right to surprise, to interrupt, to argue. It no longer served structure alone. It questioned it. After centuries of discipline and restraint, percussion remembered something ancient. Rhythm is not meant to behave. It is meant to move people. As the 20th century accelerated, drums were reshaped by machines. Electricity, amplification, and mass production transformed percussion from a physical presence into a force that could dominate space. Rhythm grew louder, heavier, and impossible to ignore. The invention of amplification changed everything. Drums no longer needed to compete with horns or guitars acoustically. Microphones pulled subtle strikes into focus, while amplifiers allowed sheer volume to overwhelm a room. Power became a feature. The beat was no longer felt only in the body. It rattled walls, floors, and chests. Rock music pushed this to its limit. The drum kit expanded in size and aggression. Bass drums deepened, cymbals multiplied. Drumming emphasized repetition and impact rather than complexity. The goal was not conversation, but propulsion. Rhythm drove crowds forward as a single mass. The beat became physical force. At the same time, industrialization standardized instruments. Drum kits were manufactured at scale, tuned for consistency rather than individuality. What was gained was accessibility. Anyone could buy a kit, learn the patterns, and join the rhythm. What was lost was regional variation. Sound began to flatten. Electronic technology took this even further. Drum machines removed the human body entirely. Perfect timing replaced feel. Beats looped endlessly without fatigue. This precision fit a world built on schedules, factories, and digital grids. Rhythm became mechanical, yet this did not erase emotion. Instead, it changed how it was delivered. Electronic beats created hypnotic repetition, inducing trance states not unlike ancient ritual drumming, but stripped of visible ceremony. Clubs replaced fire circles, lights replaced torches. The beat remained. Genres splintered rapidly. Funk emphasized groove. Metal emphasized speed and force. Hip-hop reclaimed rhythm as language, looping breaks and turning drums back into narrative tools. Sampling resurrected old beats, placing history inside new machines. Technology also democratized rhythm. You no longer needed strength, training, or physical endurance. You needed software. Rhythm became programmable, editable, shareable. The drum spread faster than ever before, crossing borders in seconds. But something uneasy emerged. As beats multiplied, silence vanished. Rhythm became constant background noise in ads, phones, public spaces. The drum risked losing meaning through overuse. Still, the core remained. No matter how artificial the tool, the effect was familiar. The body responded. Feet tapped, heads nodded, hearts aligned. Technology did not replace the drum. It magnified it, turning the oldest human sound into the loudest voice of the modern world. At the end of its long journey, the drum has not settled into a single role. It has accumulated them. What began as instinct became ritual, command, community, rebellion, and machine, without ever losing its core function. The drum still does what it has always done. It aligns bodies, carries memory, and demands response. In the modern world, drums exist everywhere, often unnoticed. They pulse beneath music, advertising, film, and daily noise. Yet when rhythm is stripped away, absence is immediately felt. Silence without beat is unsettling. The drum remains a psychological anchor. Across cultures, traditional drumming persists alongside electronic production. Indigenous rhythms are preserved, revived, and recontextualized. Drums appear in protests, ceremonies, and healing practices, not as nostalgia, but as continuity. Rhythm still gathers people when words fail. Drumming has also returned to the body. Percussion circles, therapeutic drumming, and communal rhythm practices reclaim something ancient: participation without performance. You do not need talent to beat time. You need presence. This accessibility explains why drums remain powerful long after more complex instruments have risen and fallen. At the same time, the future of drumming is uncertain. Artificial intelligence can now generate perfect rhythms endlessly. Machines can simulate human feel convincingly. Precision is no longer a limitation. Meaning, however, remains unresolved. A flawless beat does not guarantee connection. What separates a drum from noise is intention. Someone chooses when to strike. Someone responds. Even in digital spaces, rhythm still seeks bodies to receive it. The drum's history reveals a pattern. Whenever rhythm becomes too controlled, it escapes. Whenever it is banned, it reappears elsewhere. Whenever it is mechanized, it finds a way back into flesh. This cycle has repeated for thousands of years. The drum does not evolve toward complexity. It circles back to necessity. It thrives where speech collapses, where order fails, where people need to move together without explanation. From tribal fires to concert stages, from battlefield signals to bedroom speakers, the drum remains unchanged in purpose, even as tools shift. It is still the fastest way to turn many into one. The history of drums does not end here because rhythm does not conclude. As long as humans have bodies, there will be a beat to follow, steady, insistent, and impossible to silence.